Hello, and welcome to Heilman Haver, the Stage and Screen podcast, coming to you from Casa de Quinn and 1111 Studios in beautiful Port Orchard, Washington. I'm Greg Heilman.
And I'm Matt Haver. We're two local actors looking to hone our craft by exploring the best in local theater and on the big screen. Each week we bring you entertainment news and views, celebrate classic Hollywood, enjoy cocktails with a Tinseltown twist, interview talented local actors and directors, and chat with industry experts from LA to the UK.
Today is Friday, October 15th. Welcome to episode 48. We're excited to have New York Times bestselling author and biographer of the stars, Scott Eyman, returning to the show. His new book, 20th Century Fox, Darryl F. Zanuck and the Creation of the Modern Film Studio, was just published by Turner Classic Movies and is the story of one of the most influential studios in film history, from its glory days under the leadership of legendary mogul Darryl Zanuck up to the 2019 buyout by Disney.
Well, we love anything connected to Turner Classic Movies and are already looking forward to our next Movies of the Decade event at the historic Roxy Theater, when we'll get to hear from our friend and former guest, Jeremy Arnold. Be at the Roxy Saturday, October 23rd at 6:30 p.m. for Moulin Rouge, starring Ewan McGregor and Nicole Kidman. This will be Jeremy's final intro for the series, so get your tickets now at roxybremerton.org.
And just a block or so away from the Bremerton Roxy is another establishment Matt and I like to frequent, Remedy Speakeasy, an employee-owned bar and restaurant inspired by the 1920s speakeasy culture. On this week's episode of In the Mix, we met up with owner Alison Crow for a round of Mary Pickfords, a delicious Prohibition-era rum-based cocktail, and some trivia about Pickford, her influence on Hollywood history, and her historic love affair with Douglas Fairbanks. Check it out now on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel.
And speaking of love affairs, opening this evening at Western Washington Center for the Arts, A.R. Gurney's Pulitzer Prize-winning two-person show, Love Letters. Directed by our friend Dan Estes and featuring a rotating cast of 6, Love Letters is a nuanced examination of shared nostalgia, missed opportunities, and deep closeness between two friends, Andy and Melissa, over the course of 50 years. I'll be playing Andy on October 17th, 23rd, and 29th, but whatever show you choose, we know you'll enjoy this funny and tender show. Tickets can be found at WWCA.us, and thanks for supporting WWCA.
And now we're pleased to welcome a gentleman who knows just a little thing or two about famous actors. Scott Eyman is the biographer of the stars like John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, and Henry Fonda, Ernst Lubitsch, John Ford, Cecil B. DeMille, and he joined us back in May for episode 28 to celebrate the release of his last book, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise.
Scott's latest work, 20th Century Fox, Darryl F. Zanuck and the Creation of the Modern Film Studios, comes to us from Turner Classic Movies and examines one of the preeminent producers of films, filmmakers, and stars for almost 85 years, focusing on the man most responsible, producer and movie mogul, Darryl F. Zanuck.
Scott is a prolific author, with 3 of his books being New York Times bestsellers. He has been awarded the William K. Everson Award for Film History by the National Board of Review, and he teaches film history at the University of Miami. Scott joins us from his home in West Palm Beach. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Glad to be here.
Oh, glad to have you. So you've profiled several other lions of Hollywood, to borrow from the title of your book about Louis B. Mayer, actually. When did you first become interested in Darryl Zanuck or 20th Century Fox, if you can separate the two? How did the story come about?
I was always interested in Darryl Zanuck. When I was a kid, I liked his films a lot. I liked his films when he was a production head at Warner's, Public Enemy, Little Caesar, those wonderful pictures he made with Bill Wellman, Wild Boys of the Road, those pre-code pictures where a woman was as liable to get a grapefruit shoved in her face as a champagne glass. And then I was interested also in how he completely reinvented himself when he left at the Warner's and went to first his own independent company, 20th Century, and then when he merged with Fox. He didn't try to replicate what he'd been doing at Warner Brothers, which is the kind of default position, for any successful producer. They try to transpose what they're doing from place to place. And he didn't do that. He didn't even attempt to do that. He really didn't start making any equivalent pictures until after World War II with Kiss of Death and Cry of the City and those pictures, those noirs he was making with Henry Hathaway and Jules Dassin. But he completely reinvented himself. And I thought, well, that's nimble and that's interesting. And I liked both sets of pictures, both the pictures he was making at Warner's in the early 30s and the noirs he made at Fox in the 20s, in the 40s rather. And in between that, he completely reinvented himself, and he completely reinvented 20th Century Fox to a great extent. So he was unusually emotionally and intellectually nimble for a studio head. Because if you look at the first generation of moguls and the second generation of moguls, from Louis B. Mayer to David Selznick to Sam Goldwyn, they were all basically locked into doing one thing. Louis B. Mayer was helpless after leaving MGM. He never made another movie. David O. Selznick could only make David Selznick pictures. Goldwyn could only make Goldwyn pictures. There was no particular versatility in their skill set. Zanuck could shuffle the deck, and no matter what cards were dealt him, he could come up with a successful motion picture or a successful formula for a motion picture, even if it didn't seem to be his particular skill set. So I found that very interesting.
You mentioned the pre-code films, and he had I guess was the most successful independent studio before coming over to Fox with 20th Century. How did he make the transition from pre-code to code? I mean, obviously, reading through your book, you mentioned a few places where he had some issues or challenges with the production code folks. But how was that transition from pre-code to having to be a little more strict with his films?
Well, it was less a matter of censorship because he adapted fairly well to the strictures of the Breen office, or the Hayes office, if you will. What was different was his personnel, because even if he wanted to do at Fox, 20th Century Fox, what he'd been doing at Warner's, he couldn't do it, because when he went over to Fox in 1935, they had Warner Baxter, they had Shirley Temple, and Will Rogers, but Will Rogers was about to die in a plane crash, so he didn't really have Will Rogers. So there was no way you're going to make a series of noirs with Shirley Temple and or Warner Baxter. It was a really limited group of roster of players. So, but he didn't even try really to do freelance versions of the pre-code films. He simply went in a different direction. He developed a matinee idol, Tyrone Power, out of nothing, which was his only really huge major star that he created, male star. Of course, he had Alice Faye and Betty Grable on the distaff side, as well as Linda Darnell and a few others. He had more luck with women actresses than he did with male actors, actually. So it was less a matter. He wasn't affected over much by external forces. He was like a quarterback who could read the defense and work around it.
I'm curious how much you say his background would play into that, seeing as he had a somewhat tumultuous youth, abandoned by his parents, young, went to World War I, fought in World War I, came back, wanted to do some writing, started writing some very successful plots for things like Rin Tin Tin, etc. Do you think that kind of upbringing just played into some of the flexibility that he was able to use later on when it came to running these different studios and going different directions like that?
I don't see how it could have done anything but help him. Also, you have to overlook one great motivating factor. He didn't have any money. He was poor. In this, he was absolutely in line with the Warner Brothers and Louis B. Mayer and that whole generation. I mean, they got out of Russia, one step ahead of the Cossacks. Mm-hmm. So they had all the motivation in the world to come to America. Zanuck was born in Nebraska, but he was still poor, and he still had to accumulate some kind of financial and psychological foundation beneath him. And he was a storyteller. You could tell from those early things he's writing when he's a teenager on a train that he's always transposing everything he sees into narrative, into a story, into a saga. And like many creative people, he put himself at the center of his stories, or his vision of himself in variations on his own character. Can-do guys like Spencer Tracy and Stanley and Livingston, that kind of thing. People who didn't take no for an answer. So he was of his generation, and he was also a throwback to the earlier generation, founding generation of moguls. But I don't think he was ever overstressed by external circumstances until the 1950s came along. And I think, frankly, if he'd been younger, that wouldn't have stressed him either. But he'd been working 70 and 80-hour weeks for 25 years at that point, and he had just hit the wall.
You had talked about some of the differences in studios a little bit. In your book, you mentioned how each of the major studios, Warner Brothers, Paramount, all seem to gravitate towards a certain niche, and they kind of stay in that niche. But Zanuck kind of was a little more flexible. But I want to go back to why the studios felt like did they feel like they had to be in a niche, or was it just that was their strong suits and that's just what they stuck with?
I think it was a version of what we today would call branding. You could tell a Paramount picture from the look. It was very gauzy, very soft focus. You could tell an MGM picture from the look. All that white light coming in from the top of the set. And the fact that they didn't use the sets were very creamy and pale cream colored. Warner's is sooty, and hard-edged. Warner's is, RKO is also hard-edged. But each of them had a look. The soundtracks, the musical soundtracks had a specific sound. An MGM soundtrack was very faint unless it was a musical. You could barely hear it sometimes because Mayer didn't particularly like music in his movies. Jack Warner blasted the soundtrack at you. It was a symphony by Max Steiner or Eric Wolfgang Korngold with accompanying visuals. So I don't think this was necessarily a conscious thing they were doing to differentiate their studio from the other guy's studios. I think it was a function of their merchant mentality. If you're running a department store and there's another store 2 or 3 blocks down, you've got to sell something different. You can't sell the same merchandise at the same price. You've got to undercut them on price, or you've got to have an entirely different product line. So I think they were thinking in mercantile terms.
Oh, yeah, that actually brings us to innovation and risk-taking. We talked about his flexibility and interest in finding that solid footing for himself, but he was also a risk-taker, shepherding in talkies with the jazz singer, etc., banking on technology and innovation, knowing that there could be a huge downside, especially financially. What was it about Zanuck that made him that kind of risk-taker?
Well, the jazz singer and sound was more a function of Sam Warner and the peculiar dichotomy of the brothers than it was Zanuck. He hadn't yet taken production head responsibilities at that point. It came a year later. But his fearlessness really comes into play with CinemaScope in the early 1950s, because he felt the industry's back was against the wall. Between 1946 and 1953, 54, box office declines by over 40%, close to 50%.
Wow.
That's an extinction event. That's like what's happened with newspapers and magazines. It's an extinction event. If you can't come up with something to get the audience back in the theaters, you're out of business in another 5-10 years. So he was very aggressive by instinct. He was aggressive with writers. He was aggressive with stories. He was aggressive with certain directors, with artists like John Ford or Ernst Lubitsch. He let them be who they were because he knew that you have to let a real artist alone. But he realized that something had to be done, so he bet it all on coming up with some variation on Cinerama out of one lens, which the whole industry was trying to get, because This Is Cinerama had such a huge impact at the box office, not because of what it was, but because of how it was presented. It was just a series of shorts. It was a series of James Fitzpatrick shorts projected at 160 degrees, circular and immersive technology. And people lined up to see these what were essentially cheesy travelogues in this brilliant new production process. So nobody wanted to do another Cinerama because it was extremely expensive and it was hard to make any money because the overhead was so high, because you had to rehab the theaters, you had to lose a lot of seats to make room for the screens, you had to install 4 projection booths, 3 for the films and 1 for the soundtrack. It was an expensive operation to run. So the gross was high, but the net was not high. So everybody's looking for the same equivalent effect with one projector, preferably the same projectors they've already got. So he came up with the idea of using this lens that had been invented, 30 years earlier, almost 30 years earlier, in the wake of Abel Gance's Napoleon. And they bought it and spent about $10 million developing it and rushing it into production. Even though, and this was the real gamble, even though the patent in Europe had expired and it had never been patented at all in America, which meant that all anybody had to do was get their hands on a lens, take it apart, and figure out how it was done and do a knockoff version. And they could go ahead and do it, and they couldn't, and there was nothing Fox could do to stop them. So the lenses had to be guarded, like with police, armed guards, so that nobody could steal one of the lenses and do a knockoff.
A little reverse engineering, huh?
That totally reverse engineering, or avoid reverse engineering.
Yeah.
So, he thought that 3D was a fad and pointless, and it wouldn't work. And indeed, it has turned out to be a fad every time it's been introduced. In my lifetime, it's been introduced.
Time and again, yeah.
And it's failed every time, ultimately, because it's a gimmick. It doesn't really add anything to the movie. Although there were a couple of exceptions with the last iteration. I thought Gravity was an interesting use of 3D. But he understood that something had to be done, that the industry had to throw aside conventional wisdom and roll the dice. And that's what he did, and it worked. It was a short-term solution, but it stopped the bleeding, which was it was triage. He was doing triage, and it worked. By 1960, the thrill had gone, and everybody had, and there were all these competing widescreen processes by people who had gotten their hands on the lenses and taken it apart and said, well, that's okay, but we can do it better if we do it this way. And indeed, the later iterations, knockoffs of CinemaScope, were superior to CinemaScope. But by that time, the industry had stabilized.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about fads and things like that. I mean, Walt Disney had a couple of things with the multiplane camera, things like that to change the way things were done.
Technorama.
Yeah, but it's not just coming up with the idea. You have to do it intelligently too, because otherwise you could bleed a lot, like you were saying, bleed a lot of money, or maybe it's got not the right time. But it seems like CinemaScope came at the right time when it had to help save the industry, really.
Oh yeah, and I mean it was the tail wagging the dog, because if you look at The Robe, and if you look at There's No Business Like Show Business, those early CinemaScope films, there's nothing special about them as movies. Divorced from the process. It was the process that people were coming to see, and the immersion in the color and the stereophonic sound and the technical aspects of the film. The movies themselves as scripts, as direction, are nothing special. But that wasn't the point, and he understood that wasn't the point.
When it came to the actual day-to-day making of the films, you talk about Zanuck's ability to know when a scene, individual scene itself is losing steam. Was he hands-on all the time with most of the big films that came through 20th Century Fox, or just certain ones that he paid special attention to?
He was hands-on with the A pictures. He was hands-on with the expensive pictures. He was hands-on with anything that said Darryl F. Zanuck Presents. If it said 20th Century Fox Presents, if it was a B picture, no, he didn't pay any attention to it. Saul Wurtzel ran the B picture operation, and he didn't care. Because the B pictures were there for one reason, well, two reasons. They were there to soak up studio overhead, and if hopeful to eke out a profit per picture, 10,000, 20,000 a piece, cumulatively over the season, over a year. It would return. The B pictures could return a fair amount of money. But after World War II, that disappeared as the audience began getting leached away, and then television arrives with both feet, and B pictures are absolutely wiped out until they're reinvented for the drive-in by American International and companies like that. But he paid strict attention to all the A pictures, any major star, Tyrone Power, Linda Darnell, the major directors, Lubitsch, Ford, Mankiewicz. He hovered ceaselessly over the scripts. He hovered over the production. That said, he would let John Ford be John Ford and Ernst Lubitsch be Ernst Lubitsch, because you can't hire people like that and then try to fit them into a mold, because they're not mold filmmakers. They're filmmakers who create their own mold, and you have to respect that. And he understood that. So he basically left Ford alone, except for tiny little things like My Darling Clementine, where Ford had ended the film without Wyatt Earp kissing Clementine. And so they called back, Zanuck called back for a retake, and Fonda pecks her on the cheek, which of course irritated Ford, but it's not a big deal in the overall context of the movie.
When you talk about A and B pictures, now I think of the studio system where, if my research has served me correctly, in order to show an A film, you had to also agree to show the B films as well, right? So theaters were contractually obligated to show these B films, regardless of how good they were.
Well, basically they were a function of the Depression. When the Depression lands with both feet in 1931-32, the industry realizes that, how do we fight this? Well, they fought it by giving people something extra. They started making two pictures for the price of one, essentially, and the double feature became ubiquitous. But on the other hand, they would always bracket an A picture with a cheaper B picture for financial reasons, because the B pictures were basically distributed for flat fees. You'd pay $20 a day or $50 a day or whatever the going rate was. Whereas the A picture was on a rental, was a strict rental item. So, but because the B picture was a flat fee, there was really no advantage to making them really good, because you wouldn't really make any more money if the picture was good than it would if the picture was totally mediocre, because they knew, looking at the previous 3 or 4 Charlie Chan pictures, what they would gross. So the fifth Charlie Chan picture was going to gross within the same, give or take $5,000 or $10,000. That's just reasonable. That's business 101. So all those B pictures at Fox were kind of, once they've established a groove, whether it was the Michael Shane pictures with Lloyd Nolan, or the Charlie Chans with Warner Oland, and then after he died, Sidney Toler. They're all on an equivalent level. They're watchable. What sets the Fox Bees apart from other studios' Bees is they're just a little bit better. They're faster. They're not as dull as some of the other B pictures from, say, Paramount or MGM. And I detect that. I ascribe that to basically a kind of a washover effect from Wurtzel being paranoid about Zanuck landing on him with both feet. Because William Fox had spent 15 years landing on poor Saul Wurtzel with both feet. And then Fox loses control of the studio through bankruptcy. And Zanuck comes in. And Zanuck basically says, here's your keys to the Western Avenue studio. These are the pictures you got to make. And I'll see you at the end of the year and for a banquet or something, Wurtzel had a lot of autonomy in making those B pictures, as long as they were made for a price.
Something you just said reminded me of the way that you tied, in your intro, the work of Zanuck and Fox as well, right up to today with the 2018 takeover by Disney. And consolidation seems to be the name of the game. And something that I really enjoyed was the fact that you said Fox and Zanuck probably wouldn't be surprised. They would have been surprised that it was purchased by Disney, because Disney was boutique at the time. They're not boutique anymore.
No.
And what can Disney do at this point, or allow Legacy Fox to keep doing, to keep storytelling like Zanuck did alive?
I think Disney bought Fox for streaming reasons. I think it gave them a huge volume of content for Disney Plus and whatever other services they might start down the road. And it also gave them a huge volume of material for remakes, as with Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley, which is coming out in a couple months, which has caused people to perk up and take a look at the Tyrone Power version from 1947, as they should. It's a good picture. Although Zanuck didn't want to make it, and was dragged kicking and screaming into making it, because Tyrone Power had been a good company man for 10 years at that point, and had done everything Zanuck had asked him to do, even when he didn't want to do it. So Zanuck owed him one, and Zanuck knew he owed him one, so he let it go ahead and make it. That said, Power loved making the picture, and he was proud of it, as he should have been. But I don't know that the lessons of Darryl Zanuck's Fox are applicable in the 21st century. Zanuck would have been stunned at Disney's purchases, as you mentioned, of the studio, because Disney, in that era that he was aware of Disney, put out an animated feature every 3 or 4 years, and a series of shorts, and maybe 3 or 4 live action pictures a year, and that was it. Yeah. There was not a lot of production. It was a boutique studio. But Zanuck also understood that corporations get senile, just like people do. And Fox had been on the verge of senility before he took it over, and gave it an injection of youthful energy and optimism. And that was no longer the case in the 21st century. The studio was kind of noodling along in second gear, somewhere between second and third gear, but they certainly weren't burning anything up. I don't think the other studios were scared of them. I think the other studios were all scared of China, and how do we compete in the streaming world, So I think it was a library play, and I think it was a remake play. And you'll see a lot of stuff popping up down the road on television, on channels, on one channel or another, and in films that derive from the Fox purchase.
Hopefully those remakes or replays will, like you said, send people back to some of these originals. That would be one positive,
sure.
I think. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah, and that's why Nightmare Alley, the original, is in what amounts to. I'm sure more people are seeing it now than saw it in 1947. Because Criterion put it out on Blu-ray, the Fox Movie Channel runs it, TCM runs it. Everybody's suddenly running Nightmare Alley.
You had mentioned the going on to the Disney thing. A lot of that was, I think, some of the acquisitions Fox had made for distribution overseas as well, that Disney was trying to get. So yeah, for that streaming part, the one thing I've noticed is all of the old Fox movies that are showing up on Disney Plus, which is giving them, some new visibility, which is not bad. Sure. One of them being, well, no, actually not on Disney Plus, but Ford versus Ferrari. You cited in your book as maybe as kind of the last film of the old 20th Century Fox studio pre-merger with Disney, and something that Zanuck would have been possibly proud of.
I thought that film, which I didn't expect. I had no expectations of it, and I'm a car guy up to a point, but I know nothing about Formula One. I thought it incarnated a lot of Zanek's virtues in a surprisingly adept updating to the 21st century. Because essentially, if you boil it down, it's a love story between two men, just like a lot of Zanek's films. It's these two guys, and they settle everything with a fist fight, just like in a medium range John Ford film. So it's got these basic movie tropes that I don't believe actually happened for a minute, I might add. But it's got these basic movie tropes that we've been inculcated with over the last 120 years. This is the way alpha males settle their issues. They punch it out, and then they're brothers under the skin. That thing. And if it's not done really well, it's corny as hell, and you snicker at it. But Mangold and his cast managed to sell it because the backdrop is unfamiliar, and it's very masculine and it's very alpha. At the same time, it makes enough gestures towards these guys' emotional bonds with their women so that we accept them. We're not put off by them, even though they're classic alpha males. And I thought it incarnated a lot of Zanek's storytelling virtues, because Zanek was also a car guy. He made a movie called The Racers with Bella Darby, one of his disastrous mistresses that he tried to pump into being a movie star. And poor Kirk Douglas had to take the fall to work with her. And that was about Formula One in 1955, the 1955 version of Formula One. So I'm sure Zanek would have gotten a kick out of the movie, because Fox and Mangold made a much better Formula One movie than Zanek did, and he would have been the first to recognize.
It's good. I really like it. It's one of those that is in my library of when I'm going around the channels and I see it on, I just stop there and watch it. I've probably seen it in some incarnation probably over 10 times already. So Scott, is this your first collaboration with TCM Press?
Yes.
What was it like to work with them compared to maybe some of your other publishers?
I worked with the editor. TCM really never came into it, unless there's something going on I didn't know about. Because I had talked with the editor, 5-6 years ago, at a TCM film festival, and she talked about how much she liked my books and blah blah blah. And I said, well, that's fine. And I filed it away like greedy writers always do. But I was booked very heavily for the near future between, I think it already started on Cary Grant at that point. And there was another, and Hank and Jim, I think, was in process. I'd finished Hank and Jim, but I was still working on some smaller aspects of it. And Cary Grant was looming up. So I was backed up, but once I finished those, I got back in touch with Cindy at Running Press, and it was a very smooth partnership, because she's been doing this a while and I've been doing this a while.
One of our favorite guests is Jeremy Arnold, who's done several books with TCM, and we love speaking with authors on this program. And one of the biggest challenges that we've heard come up for biographers is oftentimes finding firsthand accounts and history to draw from. Now, there seems to be no shortage for Zanek, but did you run into any roadblocks? Was there any trouble getting any information for this book?
The only roadblocks was the pandemic, because all the libraries were closed. So what I had to do was draw on my own files, stuff that I'd gotten from previous research in libraries. And I called on for other authors I know who had done research on other people for stuff that they might have, and my friend Al Rody and a number of other people came through for me. Otherwise, it would have been a much thinner book. But I had to be dexterous in my juggling of sources, because I wasn't able to. Neither I nor my researcher, Will Coates, were able to spend months at the Academy Library or USC, which was a problem, a conceptual problem. I just had to figure workarounds.
So, majority of your research is still done old school in a library. Is it what it sounds like?
Well, to a great extent, because there's fewer people to talk to about the period that I like to write about, which is essentially the studio era, which more or less ends in the 60s. So, and there are less and less people to talk to, realistically. So, you're using libraries more and oral histories and things like that. And I knew this was coming, 15 or 20 years ago. You could see it coming. And I thought, well, how am I going to get around this? And people are still writing books about the Civil War, and World War II, and there's no one to talk to about the Civil War. It's a question of sifting the evidence and finding new research material. And there's always more new stuff slowly working its way to the surface, like Cecil B. DeMille's Lost to Egypt in the Sands of the Desert in California.
Well, the book is called 20th Century Fox, Darryl F. Zanuck, and the Creation of the Modern Film Studio. Our guest has been Scott Eyman. Scott, it's been great to talk to you again. As always, what's up next for you other than the press junket for for the current book?
I'm working on a project that'll probably be out in 2024, maybe 23. It depends. It's a book about Charlie Chaplin, kind of narrowly focused book about certain aspects of Charlie Chaplin's incredibly dramatic life.
Well, look forward to that. This has been a great interview. Thank you so much for your time today, Scott. We enjoyed the book, and hope everybody will race out and pick up a copy. We appreciate you sharing a little behind the scenes on how it was compiled today.
My pleasure, guys. Anytime. Happy to do it.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you again to our guest, Scott Eyman. His new book, 20th Century Fox, Darryl F. Zanuck, and the Creation of the Modern Film Studio, is available now in hardcover, audiobook, and Kindle formats, everywhere fine books are sold.
And if you enjoy the show, please make sure to follow us and share the podcast with a friend. Tell them to visit heilmanandhaver.com and tune in on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora.
Keep up with all the latest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and check out special segments like In the Mix and Get to Know a Theater on YouTube. As always, thank you for supporting local theater and for joining us here on Heilman and Haver.